I think Islam hates us. There's something there that there's a tremendous hatred there. There's a tremendous hatred. We have to get to the bottom of it.
That, of course, was Donald Trump responding to Anderson Cooper in 2016. And by us, of course, he meant Americans, white Christian Americans. Trump was energizing his base, doubling down on his proposed Muslim ban, and in doing so, trying to erase the historical fact that Muslims have been part of the American story since before the country was founded. Many scholars contend that Muslim explorers made their way to the New World during the era of the conquistadors. And the history of Islam in the U.S. is as fraught as the history of the country itself, in part because 10 to 15% of the men and women kidnapped in Africa and sold into slavery are believed to have been Muslim. Here in New York, Brooklyn is home to one of the oldest mosques in America, and it is also home to one of the largest and most diverse Muslim populations in the country. They're from Egypt, Pakistan, Puerto Rico, Azerbaijan, Somalia, Yemen, and more, and their identities and heritage have shaped the borough in countless ways. A new project by the Brooklyn Historical Society seeks to record and amplify the stories of Brooklyn's Muslim communities. And to tell us more, we're joined by the director of the Muslims in Brooklyn Oral History Project, Zaheer Ali. Welcome back to 112 BK.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about the project and how it came about.
The project came about because of the silences that we found in the archive. You know, the history that you recited about the history of Muslims in the United States and certainly in New York City is a history that is hard to find in traditional, conventional archives. And one of the ways that oral historians have served these silences is by adding more stories and adding people's actual voices and stories to the archive. And so we saw the need to add to that history, or to add to that knowledge of that history. And so we embarked on this project, Muslims in Brooklyn, not only to add their voices to the archive, but to amplify their voices so that fellow Brooklynites and New Yorkers and Americans could learn more about who we are as a community, as neighborhoods, as a borough, as a nation, by learning about our shared religious heritage.
And you're an oral historian.
Yes.
And I think one of the interesting things about written history is that so often it tells a very limited view of the story of victors. And so oral history can come in to, as you say, fill in the gaps.
That's right.
I'm curious about what some of the earliest written records of Muslims in New York are that you found.
I think the earliest records really coincide with the founding of one of the earliest communities, which is the American Mohammedan Society, which was founded in Williamsburg by people who had immigrated to the United States from the Eastern European, Lithuanian, Belarus region. They're often referred to as Tatar, the Tatar community, and they established that society in 1907. And by 1931, they had opened up a mosque, which still stands on Power Street in Williamsburg. It is the oldest continuously running mosque in New York City, in New York State, and I think one of the oldest in the country.
Tell me about how many people you interviewed for this project and how you set about finding them.
We set about to do 50 interviews, which is a fairly substantial amount for an oral history. And when we do oral history interviews, an oral history interview can be 2 to 3 hours, and our commitment as an institution is to transcribe those interviews, to catalog, describe those interviews, to archive those interviews in order for them to be accessible. It isn't enough just to record an interview and store it away. We interviewed people who had stories of migration within the United States to Brooklyn. We interviewed people who had stories of being born in Brooklyn several generations deep. We interviewed people who had a family that was rooted in traditional expressions of Islam. We also interviewed people who had made a spiritual journey to Islam during their life. And it was really important for us to do this to show the just the diversity of experiences and people and nationalities and ethnicities and even gender identities that comprise people who identify themselves as Muslim. I think we really wanted to do is shatter the idea that you could figure out who a Muslim is. And so this collection hopefully helps challenge people's narrow sense of who a Muslim is.
And how do you go about finding the people who represent Islam in Brooklyn? Did you work with different mosques? Did you ask imams to recommend people? Did you place a Craigslist ad? How do you find people?
Well, we started doing research, and through research began identifying important stories, whether it's the story of the Williamsburg community, the story of historic mosques or mosque communities or community organizations. We didn't want to limit it just to religious institutions because like any other religious group, we know that there are people who identify themselves as Muslim who may not be regular attendees at a religious center, right? So we just did research and we began canvassing. We certainly talked to people in communities. We talked to elders. We talked to young people. We talked to activists. We talked to organizers to get a sense of who we should talk to, who had stories that were interesting.
Let's play a little bit of one of the interviews. As anyone who lives in Brooklyn knows, each building used to be something else, and this clip is about that.
Masjid Khalifa, when it was purchased by Minister Malcolm, it was a dance hall. Because my father used to party here. When he was like, oh, I know this place. And Masjid Taqwa was a cocktail lounge. It was called Earl's Cocktail Lounge, which I myself knew because that block was in the time of the 60s and 70s, it was heroin central. And in the late 80s and 90s, it was crack central. So that block was always notorious, and that was a cocktail lounge. Yasin Masjid was, the one in East New York, was a youth center. And Masjid Mu'minun, if I'm not mistaken, was a slaughterhouse.
What I really like about that clip is that it shows how Muslims are both responding to and also transforming the space, the actual physical built environment of Brooklyn. And I think one of the things we do as the Historical Society Brooklyn Historical Society is place-based history. And what makes some of the experiences of Muslims in Brooklyn so unique is the physical surrounding, the physical environment. And the narrator, Sheikh Abdullah Rashid, talks about a historic community that was founded by Malcolm X when he was in the Nation of Islam. But I think it also highlights one of the kind of narrative threads of Islam in the United States is that for many people who embrace or celebrate their religious heritage, they see Islam as a reform a movement or as a movement of moral reform. And so being able to transform a space that was, say, previously used for selling alcohol or a bar or something like that into a sacred space, I think is as much part of the story of Islam in Brooklyn and the United States as is the actual transformation of the building.
That's a beautiful metaphor.
Yes.
One of the things that I think must be unusual about being Muslim in Brooklyn is that the diversity of the community is quite different than you might see, say, in Minneapolis, where maybe if you go to mosque, everybody is from Somalia.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that? And did people mention what that was like to have people of the same religion come from so many different nationalities and cultures?
You know, it's really interesting. There's a famous quote, and I'm going to paraphrase, of Martin King, where he says, Sunday is the most segregated hour in American life. What's interesting is for Muslims, and Friday, the congregational prayers Friday afternoon, might be the most integrated hour in American life, because you can go to most any mosque and see in the ranks of people lined up for prayer. So you have that kind of diversity. And, you know, in Islam, there's this Quranic verse that says, you know, where God is speaking to his people saying, we made you into different people and tribes and nations so that you may know each other, not despise each other.
May I ask, do you identify as Muslim?
I do.
I imagine this might have been quite a personally meaningful project for you, and I'm wondering if there was anything that you found surprising in conducting these interviews.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I think I found that was most surprising to me was how remarkably unremarkable being Muslim was for our narrators. And this is something that you really get when you do an oral history interview that takes you into the inner life of someone in terms of how they experience life from their perspective. But when you get beyond that distinction, people saw themselves in terms of their relationships to their parents, to their children, to their spouses, to their partners. They saw themselves either as a young person or an older person. They saw themselves as either a Brooklynite or someone who was new to Brooklyn. They saw themselves as an artist, as a musician, as an activist, as a teacher, as a doctor, as a lawyer, as an educator, that being Muslim was given. And so they didn't need to speak about it. And so what I came away from this project was that for many people, Islam is not a box that you put people in, but a box that people stand on. It's foundational to people's identity, but it doesn't tell the full story.
We're in a moment of intense Islamophobia, and I feel like there is a sense of othering of Muslim Americans, and this project aims to combat that,
yes.
I imagine, by telling the personal stories of people. Can you tell me a little bit about why you think it's important that these stories be heard and how you aim to do that?
I think these stories are important to be heard because this is part of all of our story. And, I think it's important for us to understand when we talk about America, and we're talking about everyone in America, and the idea that this is a country just for a certain group of people or a certain religion just isn't borne out in the history. It isn't borne out in the actual lived experience of people who are Americans and who live here. And I think it's also important to understand the integral role that Muslims have played in the shaping of the American story. And so to try to edit us out is going to leave a lot of that story out. It's going to leave us with question marks about understanding who we are as a nation.
And this is a hard question, I'm sure, but maybe you can leave us with one particular story or anecdote that has stuck in your memory or that is personally meaningful to you.
It changes, this is like asking someone their favorite child, and I'm going to talk about the child that's on my mind today. I think one of the stories that really lingers with me is one of a young narrator, Muhammad Fayez, who is 24 at the time we did the interview, I think. And he talks about the complicated identity of being Muslim and in his experience and a group that he and his friends formed called Messy Muslims. And I think, a lot of us, when we think of religious people, again, we think of their adherence to all of these religious dictates and doctrines. And I think, like every other religious people or spiritually minded people strive to do those things, but they also live their lives as human beings. And I think his story is one of someone who struggles with adherence to the faith, but very much returns back to it over and over again as a source of strength and peace and solace.
Great. Well, people can hear his story and that of 49 others at the URL. One more time, please.
brooklynhistory.org/oral history.
Great. Zaheer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.